For our next session, I am very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kaitlin Roke, who is GOED's new Director of Scientific Communication and Outreach. She just started with GOED last month, but she actually has been working with our clinical study database almost since we started building it. So she has a lot of history in terms of what we're doing with the database. But she also has a PhD in omega-3s and also worked for a nutrient-based trade association and as an analyst in the healthcare sector in the Canadian government. So she has a very interesting and diverse background. And she's here to talk to you today about EPA versus DHA. So Kaitlin, welcome.
Okay, hello everyone. I know we've all been sitting for a long time, so I'm going to be that speaker that welcomes people to stand up and move around a little bit if they would like to while we're getting going. So you'll feel around on your chair that everyone has a Post-it note on their chair. So if you want to stand up and stretch while you look for it, if you want to go for a little walk, there's extras on the wall down there too if you want to move your legs a little bit. So we're going to start by everyone finding a Post-it note. So if you wanted, to take a walk and get one, great. If you wanted to bug your colleague for theirs, you can steal it from them too. So first step, stretch your arms, grab your Post-it note. Okay, so yes, thank you very much, Ellen, for the warm introduction. It's been a pleasure to meet people here at this conference. I've hoped to attend a GOED exchange for several years now, so really pleased to be here as a staff, really exciting. So as Ellen said, new in my role, just a month and a half, so I can claim the new card for a little while longer if you ask me any hard questions. But I have been working very closely with Dr. Aldo Bernasconi on the database for several years now, so it's really close to my heart. So really excited to get started on this topic, and the topic of the presentation is EPA versus DHA, and the tagline I've chosen is a duet or a solo performer. So how I like to start some of these presentations is taking a look at the media. It's really interesting to see what the media is saying and whether it makes our blood boil or makes us feel really excited. It's hard to tell. But just a sampling on these slides here show some headlines just from the last few years. So over the last few years, we've sort of seen this pitting against each other. So is it EPA that has an effect, or is it DHA? So some of these headlines are fueled by some recent literature that have come up, and some of them are just, conversation starters, we could call them. So lots of work going on in the field and lots of media talking about this topic. Okay, so we also have the Olympics going on, which feels hard to believe that the Winter Olympics are happening while we're in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But featured on the screen here, we have a terrifying but amazing event, the luge, which may be familiar to some of you. And so classically in this event, we're not going to have singles competing against doubles, but for the purposes of this, we wanted to see who would win the gold medal. So we don't have enough time to get into a full race or debate, unfortunately, today. But I wanted anyone who ended up grabbing a yellow Post-it note, you're going to represent EPA. So I want you to hold your yellow Post-it note up in the sky. Great, thank you. And our DHA are a green Post-it note. So if you have a green Post-it note, hold your Post-it note up high. Great, thank you. And lastly, we have our EPA plus DHA in the duet. So if you have a blue Post-it note, can you hang it or put it up in the sky? Great, thank you. So really scientific analytical judgment of who won the race there. With the lights in my eyes, really was easy to count them. So we'll go with DHA as the winner. I think there was a little bit more green in the audience. Thank you for participating in that. So just as a reminder, we wanted to talk about how in the foods and supplements that we're most commonly consuming, we see EPA and DHA occurring together. So in the photo here, we just have a variety of different marine sources and some different supplements, and almost all of the time we see both of these nutrients occurring together in the supplements or in the foods that we're eating. So an important reminder of how we're seeing these in our food systems and in the supplements that we might be choosing. Now I've learned that from the back of the room, especially without my glasses, I cannot read the screen, so don't worry, there won't be a pop quiz later on the details here. But the point was that on the chart on the left-hand side shows some common fish sources of EPA and DHA. And we can see that there's actually a higher proportion typically of DHA in our fish sources than EPA. And there's a lot of factors that can influence that. So the first note is just as a reminder, we have a fairly low consumption rate of fish and other marine products in the diet. So when we're looking at this, our consumers and the people in our environment aren't eating very much. And the composition can change. So a lot of you know this even more deeply than I do, that the time of year, the feed, the microalgae and the other things in the environment can heavily influence the proportion of EPA and DHA in our food sources. So it may not always look the same as this list here. Things are changing often, and it influences how we can incorporate those fatty acids into the supplements that we're making and into the fish that we're eating. I certainly am not going to get into the optimal balance. We'll have to pin down Dr. Richard Basnet or someone else for that talk, but there's a lot of discussion, as we know, about how to balance other fatty acids in our diet and the N3-N6 ratio. So there's a lot of other components that influence how much EPA and DHA we're taking into our diet. And so just as a reminder, we're actually seeing that oftentimes our supplements are slightly higher in EPA, while fish tends to be slightly higher in DHA. So this is an important note because some of the more recent research are making recommendations as if their proportions are the same. So it's just important to keep in mind that we often see this. As we know, every supplement is a little bit different, so the formulations can fluctuate, but typically we see a 1.5 to 1 ratio of EPA to DHA. So the point on the other slide just mentioned that the first commercial fish oil supplement came out about 1980. So it's been around for a while, and that original supplement had a ratio of 18% EPA to 12% DHA. So because it was one of the first of its kind, a lot of the companies that followed continued with a similar ratio. So that's one reason why we see that proportion, just as another interesting note for the industry. Okay, so our friend and colleague, Dr. Philip Calder, walked us through some of the health benefits on one of his slides today, so I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail. But we know that EPA and DHA are really important parts of our body and important parts of our body systems, and they can help with compromised or diseased states or promote improved and increased health. Most commonly, we hear of 4 main health benefits. We have heart health, brain health, pregnancy and infant development, as well as eye, acuity, and visual development. So those are kind of the 4 main areas we tend to talk the most about, but there's tons of areas. If you stopped by our clinical study database booth, we have a huge word cloud of all of the different outcomes that have been studied, and there's tons of them. We know that there's been 40,000 studies and 4,000 interventional, so there's a lot of health benefits that have been, and health effects that have been studied. We do know that there are some differential effects. So these fatty acids chemically look different. They have a different shape. They incorporate themselves into our bodies a little bit differently. So it's not to say that they act the exact same. We definitely know that they don't. So they do some different effects, and some of them have been tied to specific outcomes. So our award recipient, Dr. Susan Carlson, studied DHA and its incorporation into infant formula, for example, and that's where DHA is one example where it's really heavily focused in that area. Okay, so to really get into what we see, just as a really high level, we did use our clinical study database to help us answer the question. So as you know, I've only been here for a month and a half. I didn't have time to do a 6-month literature review in preparation for the talk, but the advantage to using our database is that we got the studies a lot faster. So in order to answer this question, we looked at 4 main categories. So we looked at studies that had EPA and not DHA, high EPA compared to DHA, and on the other side, the same thing. So DHA with no EPA, et cetera. So by using the database, we could generate a study list, which gave us at least a number. So we can say, okay, there's been about 120 studies with EPA And well, I can't do math that fast on the spot with DHA. And so what I'm going to show next is, so we generated our study list, and then I did a really brief thematic analysis. So we wanted to know, what have the topics been related to these individual fatty acids? So for EPA, I have a slide that comes after that will show you the difference between them. But we can see that 43% of the studies to date focused on EPA are related to heart health. A little bit less on blood biomarkers, body and metabolic systems, and not very much on the brain. This looks a little bit different for DHA. So different number of studies, but the proportions actually look quite a bit different. So 41% on other conditions and diseases, so this could be pregnancy, infant development, and only 10% on heart health. So to put a pin in this, there's a lot of reasons for this. It's not to say that all of the studies have been negative in one category, so we moved on, or positive, etc. It could be that, for example, I'll show the next slide here, perhaps there's more EPA studies in heart health because we need more research. Maybe we need to understand more the intricacies about how this works, so more studies have been done. So there's a lot of reasons why these numbers look the way they do, but really interesting to compare between the two of them to see where has this work been done. So yeah, just to circle that, it is a different proportion between the two of them. So this was done, we pulled the study list and then did a thematic analysis to see where the body of research was. And another component to our database, which we found helpful to get a really high-level scope of what's going on here, was to look at these different categories and how they were rated. So in order to do this, we had 2 independent researchers who reviewed the abstracts, and based on the author's conclusions, rated the article as positive, negative, neutral, or irrelevant, or unknown in some cases. And so, for example, if a study had 1 negative outcome, then the study would be listed as negative. If it had no negative outcomes and a positive outcome, then it was listed as positive. So importantly, both of these fields, whether high EPA or high DHA, had a very high positivity rate. So we're seeing good outcomes from both of these types of research related to the health outcomes. So that was very interesting, especially given the controversy between them. So really cool outcome of our database and how we could share a glimpse into the field. I don't have a countdown of the timer, so I'm just going to assume I'm good to go for the next little bit. Okay, so the next slide just talks about EPA versus DHA as being a new research area. So although this is our field of omega-3s is a fairly old field. It's been happening for a long time. We've had a lot of research, a lot of work being done looking at these two things, but comparing the individual fatty acids is fairly new, actually. And so when we think about EPA versus DHA, almost all the studies to date have focused on the combination of the two. So we see almost every study with food with both together and supplements with both together. So to date, the majority of the research has been done on the physiological and health effects related to long-chain PUFAs, as we know, as well as its used a mixture of both EPA and DHA. So there's starting to be new research that do dive into the specific and distinct roles and the effects of EPA and DHA on prevalent health outcomes, including cardiovascular disease, which those studies may be familiar to some of you, depressive disorders, and a lot of it remains fundamentally untested so far. We do see some recent studies that look at the effects of EPA versus DHA related to age and gender. So an interesting tie back to Dr. Christina Harris-Jackson's presentation yesterday when she looked at individual differences. So not surprising, we see that some age groups might have different benefits for an EPA only or DHA only, and between men and women also see differences in some of our studies. We also see some differential effects and divergent effects on our lipoprotein fractions, which may affect CVD. As we know, we're looking at the blood biomarkers, so it gives us a sense of the heart health, but it's really hard to get a true understanding of how that's related. So I think more work to be done to dive into how those lipid fractions are affecting our health outcomes. So as mentioned yesterday by Dr. Marie-Claude Vole in her presentation, so the LaMarche group, as well as the Much Research group, have done some RCTs with direct head-to-head comparisons on EPA versus DHA, amongst other groups, but those are two of the more recent studies that have been done. And one by the LaMarche group below is a meta-analysis of the RCTs that have been done. So they looked at some of the head-to-head studies, but they also went to studies and picked out the ones that had a high EPA arm or a high DHA arm. And related to inflammation, they found that both EPA and DHA had similar effects on inflammation. So in this particular meta-analysis, they didn't find a differential effect between the fatty acids of interest. Okay, so kind of tying back to our beginning note about sort of the Olympics and our activity at the beginning. So as we know, for some of you who may or may not have been watching the Olympics, the luge is just one event out of many events. It's hard to even find time to catch one. But I think this is an important message because as a supplement, omega-3s are just one of many supplements that people can choose from. So as we're thinking about how we educate consumers and the type of information they know, it's very difficult to choose what event you're going to watch or what supplement you're going to consume. So if we're thinking about our consumers in the supermarket, not only are we asking them to think about their omega-3 supplements, so we're saying, are you choosing EPA or DHA or both? What's the color of the container? What label are you looking for? What claim was interesting to you? We're asking them to do from 2 to 10 things to choose their omega supplement. We want them to make a good choice, and that's great. But that's probably just one of 20 other purchases they're going to make that day at the store. So it's a lot and fairly overwhelming to ask them to consider all of these different factors. So when we're thinking about our supplements, we know that both EPA and DHA have strong health benefits in a lot of our outcomes of interest. So just to keep in mind that the consumers are very overwhelmed with food decisions, as we know, so it's hard to make a choice, and there's lots of evidence and media, as we saw, that make it a little bit more confusing to make a good choice. Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment then to share some acknowledgements. So thank you to everyone who helped prepare for this presentation. I didn't speak very much about my PhD work today, but of course, as Ellen said, my background is in omega-3 clinical trials, so really excited to be back into that literature now. And thank you to GoEd for the opportunity to speak here today. As we've all talked about, it's been a while since we've been in person, firstly, and on a stage, secondly. Also, like not wearing pajama pants when you're presenting, weird. Definitely also haven't worn heels in a long time, so far not on my nose. So really exciting to be part of this event and to get to meet a lot of you over the course of the last few days. It's been a pleasure. And to GoEd for organizing the conference. I got to come in at the end when all the hard work had been done, so really appreciative of everything that anyone had done here. I've labeled a few specific fish, as you can see, as some individual shout outs. I've also never seen a fish open their mouth like that, so if anyone who knows more about these special fish, I would love to understand why they're doing that. They look happy or terrified, I don't really know. So Dr. Aldo Bernasconi, who can't be with us in person today, but is listening virtually, as we know, is a huge component to our data at GoEd Omega-3 and was a huge influence on helping me build this presentation and understanding how to get the data we need as part of a glimpse into this field. Of course, Ellen Shutt for listening to this presentation probably more times than she'd wanted to make sure we're feeling good for today. And some individual scientific collaborators like Dr. Bruce Hollub, one of our award recipients, Dr. Shannon Klingel, Dr. Benoit Lamarche, and Adam for their contributions and reflections in preparation for this as well. So thank you, everyone, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Kaitlin. Any questions from the audience? guess you told them everything they need to know. So if you looked at, when we looked at the positivity of EPA versus DHA, are there any insights that you can share? I guess, we talked a lot about the clinical study database and how we're saying whether something is positive, negative, or neutral, and it's only really about the abstract conclusion, so it's not something that is looking at the whole, all the different outcomes that may have been studied in a particular study. So if you look at the positivity, there's probably even more that could be said about some of the outcomes beyond what the authors were saying. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a scientist perspective, we tread carefully with our abstract conclusions because it's an interesting way to review an article, but we feel really good about it by having our two independent researchers. And as you said, it's just looking at the totality of the outcomes. So they might have measured triglycerides, blood pressure, heart rhythm. There's lots of outcomes that could be measured, and so it's just showing us a glimpse at that. So in order to get into those outcomes, reading the paper, of course, but the advanced portion of our database lists all of the individual outcomes. So if we really wanted to take a deeper look at heart rate, for example, we could search that term of interest and look specifically about what's happening to heart rate. So there's lots of ways to pull out those outcomes. And yeah, happy to talk to anyone in more detail if you're curious about any of those themes and how it related to the outcomes of that research.
Any other questions? Okay, well then we are ready for our networking break, and we will meet back here at 11:30.